The business of medicine is constantly changing. The review by Resolve discusses current contract issues for physicians, compensation trends, and tips for a successful career. Every physician's contract and career is different, and nothing in this episode should be considered legal advice. If you have specific questions about your career, please consult with an attorney. Now, on to the show.
Zach Beare, welcome to the review.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us. Do you want to start out and maybe tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself, kind of your background?
Sure. So I'm Zach Beare, as you mentioned. Been an attorney with Resolve Legal for a couple of years now, and been a practicing attorney for, I think, 6 years now.
Yeah.
And before I was with Resolve, I also did healthcare law. I worked for a state medical board, doing complaint review, licensure, all types of stuff like that.
Yeah, all that fun stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Different side. Of
different
healthcare.
side of it. Yeah, that's right. Well, we're glad that you're here talking today. We're going to hit on a topic that I think I would say 30 to 40% of our clients have issues with. We're going to talk about termination. So moving from one job to the next, and just kind of how that, one, is structured in the contract, and then two, the concerns clients have, problems. So when you're talking to a client that comes in and says, hey, I've got to exit, I've got to leave, what's that process look like?
Sure. I think the biggest question is, what does your contract say about getting out of the contract, obviously? Right. And typically there's a termination without cause section.
Okay.
Which it's standard that 90 days. You have to give 90 days notice, give the employer some time to find a replacement, get everything wrapped up.
Sure.
And that's the first thing I'm looking for.
Okay.
There's other items that are also important to look at. I think tail coverage is a big one. Whether you have
Meaning
to pay
malpractice insurance and what happens.
Whether
okay.
you have to pay for tail on the way out.
Okay.
Is there a non-compete clause?
Mm-hmm.
Will you have restrictions once you leave? And those are kind of the big three that I'm typically looking at.
Okay. So we're looking for how can you get out of the contract, and then also what, insurance problems might you have, what restrictions on where you can go to work, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other financial implications outside of tail that are coming up frequently, or is it just that the big one?
Yeah, so I think there's always a signing bonus, or, most of the time there's a signing bonus that has some type of repayment obligation tied to it, whether that's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll have to look at that and, make sure you're not on the hook for any repayment. And if you are, what is that amount?
Yeah. Yeah. When we're talking to clients, at least some of my clients, they don't know how to even go in about having that conversation with the employer. Like, how do I actually come in and say, hey, I'm done here? What do you advise, and also what's required in the contract usually on how we give that notice?
Yeah, so there's typically a notice clause within the contract that tells you how you have to provide your notice. But if you're planning on leaving, I would recommend, reaching out to an attorney, having them review the contract terms. Mm-hmm. And then I do think it's always helpful to have a discussion with your employer and just...
Yeah. Kind of that personal human interaction.
Yeah, before you just submit the written notice. I think it's always helpful to have a conversation and just explain why you're leaving, and that way there's no bad blood there.
Yeah, yeah. And we're talking right now about without cause termination, which means, there's no breach of contract issue. There's nothing that's terrible. Those are completely separate situations, and we can talk about that maybe on a different episode. We won't go there today. But so in the contract, in that notice paragraph, how are they usually required to give that notice? What's most common?
Most of the time it's either personal delivery or sent via registered or certified mail.
Like a certified mail.
Yeah, it's typically one of those two is required, or either.
Yeah. Yeah. How often do you see we allow email as part of that?
That's a good question. Not too often, maybe 10% of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see very often.
Yeah.
So I was just curious on if maybe your contracts are different. But so you have to give writing, right? It has to be signed, right, by them saying, hey, here's my last day officially. Do you often see employers wanting to accelerate that? Meaning, I'm giving you 90 days notice, and then the employer comes in and says, well, hey, we actually want you out of here in 30 days?
Yeah, so it is quite standard to have language within the contract that says the employer can accelerate your termination if you provide notice. What you want to look out for is to make sure you're getting paid for that full notice period.
Right.
and that they can't accelerate your termination, and then you're stuck without a paycheck for 2 months or so.
Right.
I think that's always my concern. I don't think it's too common for them to accelerate, though.
Yeah.
I feel like they're typically want your services
Right.
throughout that full notice period.
Yeah.
But that's a good question, and I don't know the percentage of
Yeah, well,
time.
we track a lot of data at Resolve.
Yeah.
That's not a data point
Yeah,
that we're
that's
tracking. So that's a guess on your part, which is fine. I think your point though is spot on, right? The employers, the supply and demand of physicians is just such that there's not enough physicians out there, right? So anytime a physician wants to leave, the employer usually is crap, right? now we got to go find somebody else. So they're going to want you to be there for that full 90-day period, if not longer. They may ask you to extend that if you can. Do you advise clients to, when they're looking for their next job, do you advise them to terminate their contract and then start, the process of looking? If they're interviewing, should they terminate before so they can start earlier? What's the cadence around signing a new contract versus terminating your old one?
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to have another offer in place, another signed agreement in place. Ideally, that way you do have another opportunity. You're not going to have a long period of time without a paycheck. So I think it's helpful to search for other employment, sign that contract, and then submit your termination.
Yeah, I agree. I just think it takes the anxiety out of the situation. If I'm going to start somewhere else in December, and now it's July, I can start thinking about terminating my contract, giving patients the right notification, right, that I'm going to leave, because you don't want any patient abandonment issues, right, or any licensure issues. You got to apply in a different state sometimes for licensure, which can take a long time. So there is this, thought process and being prepared component that needs to happen, I think, even before you get to turning in your termination.
Yeah, I agree. I think if your termination language is 180 days, where you have to give 180 days notice, that might change things since it's 6 months. And if you're really trying to get out of your employment, it might be better to submit that termination earlier and then maybe take the chance looking for other jobs.
Right. Yeah, it depends on how long, right? How much notice you have to give. What's the longest notice period that you've seen, as far as you've got to give us X number of days or months or years?
I think 1 year.
Yeah.
1 year's the longest.
Yeah.
And
shortest,
at will.
Yeah.
Right? They can terminate at any point in time.
Yeah. So when you're looking at your contract, if you're a physician listening to this, right, it's anywhere from 0 days, right, where you can just leave whenever you want to, pretty unlikely, up to maybe a year's notice, also fairly unlikely. Most commonly, what does the notice period look like?
90 days. 90 days is pretty standard.
Yeah.
I think we see anywhere from 60 to 120 quite often. That's kind of the common range.
Yeah. So most contracts are going to have 2 to 4 months notice that are there. Okay, good. So I'm going to recap. If you're going to terminate your contract without cause, we would encourage you to have your next position signed or close to knowing where you're going to go, right? Make sure you follow the notice termination provisions in the contract, right? You're doing the writings that you have to. Make sure you're saving the relationship, right? Having that personal conversation, with your employer. Make sure you understand how much notice you have to give, what your malpractice obligations are going to be, what your repayment obligations are going to be on signing bonuses, if there's a non-compete or not. Did we miss anything? Is that a pretty good recap?
I think that's a good recap. I mean, there's also termination for cause.
Yeah,
That,
separate
separate-
episodes. Yeah,
separate
we're just
episode.
talking with just without cause today. So
yeah, we don't want to get into breach of contract.
we don't want to go
today.
there yet. No, yeah. So okay, well, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for talking about termination without cause.
Yeah, thank you.